Modweni? Good evening. Okay. Yes, I think we are ready for some good meals this evening. Yeah? The meal is going to be spiritual. But before that, I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the Vice Chancellor of Rhodes University, Professor Sizwe Mabizela. I also welcome you on behalf of the Dean of Humanities Faculty, Professor Innocent Musido. Both of them couldn't manage to come for this event because this time of the year we have so many other events on campus, and it happens that sometimes there is clash in the way that we organize our event. Having said that, the event for tonight, we all know that it is about a book launch. A book has been published, and today we launch it. This is the spiritual food that I was talking about. Some people have already consumed this food because the book is there. I was talking to one person here this evening, and she told me that she has already read the entire book. And this event is happening in 2024. We all know that during this year, we are celebrating 120 years of the existence of our university. The university exists for the last 120 years. But it is good that this year we have events like this one. In philosophy, we are launching a book. And this book is very important. We are going to talk about it. And also, we shouldn't forget about the months during which the book is being launched. We are in May, and being in May, we are celebrating ourselves. We are celebrating our continent. We are celebrating our identities. May actually is Africa Month. Professor Kwesi Pra actually said recently on our campus that we should be celebrating Africa every day, not just in May. But it happens that we haven't changed that yet. We are still in May 2024. We have to celebrate Africa. And when it comes to this book, I want to talk first about it before I talk about the person who wrote the book. The title of the book, you can see it there. It is Camus and Fanon. These are French names. I don't know how one would read them in English, but I'm saying Camus and Fanon on the Algerian Question, an ethics of rebellion. Yes, the book is written by our colleague, Professor of Philosophy, Pedro Tabensky. And the book, in the title, you all see and you can feel the smell of the 20th century. Camus, Fanon, Algeria. It is about Algerian revolution or the war. This is 20th century. And during that century, two of the most important personalities have been mentioned. We have Camus and we have Fanon. It is a difficult task to put the two together. It is a difficult task to put the two together. There is also one missing here. I was looking here to see if Prof. Tom Martin was here. Because the one who is missing is sad. But it is quite difficult to have both of them, the two here, Fanon and Camus, in the same book. in the same book. So, others are also missing. I have mentioned Sartre, but because I could be biased, I could have mentioned also Césaire, Aimé Césaire. I could have mentioned also Léopold Sédar Senghor. Because of the background, these are the literary people, these are the writers, as Camus, as well as Fanon. That's why I'm saying they are also missing. But when we put them all together, we have one spirit. And that spirit, I will call it the spirit of the 20th century. Algeria is mentioned. Algerian war, this was the war of liberation. But does it matter that we speak about it today? The liberation, did it happen? Did it happen in the way that it was planned? Yes. We talk about Algeria, but there is someone who is missing. Because France, right, was against France. France is not mentioned here. But all is about France. And Algeria could symbolize something that exists even today. And France can symbolize something that can still exist today. That's why in the 20th century, we could still read the past and learn from it in order to take positions in the present. The reflection on the past will make us stronger to understand who we are and what we want to do. I see also that Prof. Tabensky has used the word rebellion. Yeah, I'm not an English-speaking person, but I was trying to think in French to say, is it about a revolt? Because Camus also wrote about a novel, Un homme révolté. Is it that? But Prof is saying it's not about revolution. He's saying no, it is about a rebellion. Maybe tonight he will tell us, because for some people it might be the same thing, or it might have the same result, or it might lead to the same consequences. But Prof is insisting it's not about revolution, which some people might think it is a good thing, but he's saying no, it is about rebellion. I was thinking that if it is about rebellion, then we know who is the rebel in this title. Is it Camus or Fanon? In the past, we used to say it is Fanon who is a rebel, but we will see if this is the case. It might not be the case. Whatever I have said could be too long, because I know you are waiting for Prof himself to say what he wrote. Because this is what was called in the past the war of the universals. Querelle des universaux. It can happen, let me say in football, that people were talking about Messi and Ronaldo, just to find who was better. But it is difficult to separate them. That's why we have Fanon and Camus. I will argue with Prof. Tom Martin of Sartre as well. But let's talk about Pedro, who is seeing something special in this personality of 20th century. Professor Pedro Tabensky was born in Chile from refugee parents. The father had the origin, or had Polish origin, and the mother was a survivor of Holocaust because she was born only few weeks, 2 weeks, before the end of the final solution. I'm not going to explain the final solution. I suppose that we know what it was. And he is full professor of philosophy. He has lived in the United States, in Brazil, in Australia, in Israel, in the UK, and where else?
Makanda. The pinnacle of them all.
Yes, in South Africa. He is the founding director of Alan Gray Center for Leadership Ethics. He is author of Happiness, Personhood, Community, Purpose. He has published several papers on Fanon, on Camus. He is also an editor. He has edited even books and papers and academic journals. And for tonight, it is going to be about the book that is on that table. We will have to share our thoughts about the book. But for him to do that, he's not going to be alone. He's not going to walk alone. He will never walk alone, right? There is Dr. Njovane, Dr. Thando Njovane, who is going to discuss. It is going to be a dialogue. Remember Plato, right? Dialogue. And here, I'm going to introduce you Dr. Njovane. Dr. Njovane holds a PhD in English literature. She is senior lecturer at the Department of Literary Studies in English. She is the founding co-director of Finding Africa. Finding Africa. Have you heard about that? Finding Africa. This is an interdisciplinary platform where great ideas are being discussed. It is also international. Dr. Njovane is coordinator of early career researchers at Rhodes University African Studies Center, which is working with the cluster of Africa Multiple. Her research interests include trauma and memory studies, post-conflict cultures, and also childhood. And tonight, Dr. Njovane is going to help us unearth something that we can eat, but that is going to come from Professor Tabensky and his book. For now, I'm standing between you and the food. What I will say is that I invite you for a round of applause before they start.
Thank you so much, Professor Wenwu, for that great introduction. It's actually quite a pleasure to be in dialogue with Professor Tabensky, who I will refer to as Pedro from now on. Pedro taught me philosophy many, many years ago. I won't say how many, in case you know how old we are, but I was a tiny little second-year student, and he introduced me to Fanon. So the kind of completing the circle, being here with you today. So what I'm going to start with is just providing a bit of context and framing around the book, and giving you an idea of some of the central concepts of Pedro's book, after which we'll hear from him. He will read some passages. So, to begin with, the Canadian poet Anne Carson asks, why does tragedy exist? Because you're full of rage. Why are you full of rage? Because you're full of grief. The association here between unbearable grief and uncontainable rage seem to lie at the very heart of the Algerian War for liberation. A war to which, according to Tabensky, consisted in polarizing views on the utility and limits of violent resistance and violence more generally. In Camus and Fanon on the Algerian Question, Tabensky introduces us to such a polarization by focusing on two prominent figures. One, a philosopher turned, as I hear from him, playwright, Fanon, and one, an artist, Camus turned philosopher. Camus and Fanon strike us as an unlikely pair. Fanon insists on violence, namely a peasant-led resistance to ensure the liberation of Algerian peoples, while Camus counsels restraint, positing that France can and must solve the problem that it began with its own colonialism. In other words, Camus insists that France has a role to play in a liberated Algeria. Tabensky interrogates these opposing views in stark detail in his book. He contends with the difficult questions posed by, for instance, Fanon's stance on violence in The Wretched of the Earth and other articles, which is a highly contested topic for those of us who are familiar with post-colonial theory, and particularly dealing with Fanon. Tabensky also shows us the limits of this violence, as well as its regenerative effect, which can be easily read in the post-independent moment. Fanon is wrong to insist on violence, Tabensky says, because violence is, on the one hand, regenerative, and on the other hand, ensures its own destructive repetition. Speaking of non-violence in another context, Judith Butler proposes that speaking of rage does not always allow us to see how rage carries sorrow and covers it over. Perhaps grief is imagined to end with violence, as if grief itself can be killed. So violence becomes a way of wantonly distributing the unbearable, implicating entire communities in one's own sense of grief. Fanon's understanding of violence shares with Butler the idea that violence is a solution to a seemingly otherwise unsolvable problem of subjection, of being subjected, in this case, to colonial violence. Tabensky grapples with the difficulties of an emancipatory politics mired in the urgency of the political situation in Algeria, where, following Fanon's death and the country's liberation from French colonial rule, violence did in fact reproduce itself in a different, though recognizable, guise. Fanon's notion of liberatory violence, according to Tabensky, is bound up with fantasy. Tabensky tells us that there is abundant evidence that Fanon was fighting for an idealized abstraction, a fantasy of purity driven by Fanon's idea of the new man, which we'll discuss as the launch goes on. Fanon also has silences and myths-truths about the FLN, which was the Liberation Movement Party, its own self-cannibalizing violence, which occurred even prior to independence from France. Fanon shares with Camus a particular kind of fantasy. Both of them, as you'll see from our discussion, engage in some kind of idealization. Tabensky identifies Camus' contrasting view on violence as a position that cautions against escalation of violence. He centralizes care and community in his critique of Fanon and, to a certain extent, Camus. Tabensky posits an ethics of rebellion that values community and care beyond the immediate moment. An ethics of care, according to Tabensky, does away with totalitarianism by foregrounding care and open communication in the service of the many rather than the few. He makes a convincing argument of this with reference to Camus. And now I'll read from you, as I close, from page 134, a passage from Tabensky's own words. Just find it. In his section on Camus, we don't need the world or some metaphysical being to tell us what is good. The good is in us and between us if we learn to see, that is, if we come to understand what is implied by defiance, by moral outrage. Indeed, if we learn to see what is implied by the very fact of living, hoping, and struggling. And I'll hand over to Professor Tabensky, who has a bit of a reading for us.
I have to thank Thando profusely for the beautiful gesture of organizing this. I'm not actually a friend of self-promotion. It's apparently one of the main pillars of the Academy nowadays, and it's not one that I endorse. So I kept quiet. This book was published over a year ago, but Thando gave me this gift, and it's a gift I relish. And indeed, she was my student in my African philosophy course a long time ago. So this book explores a paradox, and the paradox is, so both Fanon and Camus, and the reason why I chose these two people is, I think Sartre is a bit of a twit when it comes to Algeria. Fanon was much more subtle than Sartre, much better, and very Sartre at the same time. I deal with all the other dudes that you mentioned in passing. But both Camus and Fanon. So Camus is a Pied Noir. He's an Algerian of European descent, and he was passionately committed to the country, as was Fanon, although Fanon was born in Martinique, but he embraced the cause of liberation. And they both were very sophisticated, super clever people who tried to deal with the mess. I think Camus got the predictions better than Fanon, but Camus has his own foibles, and one of them is that if one wants to learn about Algeria, I think one needs to read Moulad Faraoun's diary. And that's just awesome. It's an awesome piece of writing in which this teacher and author, novelist, Algerian Berber, writes about the daily life of Berbers in Algeria, and then sadly he was executed by ultras, the white kooks, like the AVB here in South Africa, equivalent, that they had no better strategy than to make sure that there was no chance that France could stay. Self-defeating, last-moment desperation where Faraon was executed. And he was a big inspiration in my book. One thing that interests me is also this repeated pattern of revolutionary activity ending up in a dictatorship. So I try to explore how this happens and why it happens, and it happens over and over again. It's not like this is the only time it's happened. And I'm interested in also I'm interested in understanding what happens, because there's a kind of revolutionary zeal in South Africa sometimes that emerges, and I want to understand if this is really the right way to think about things. And I think it isn't. But the paradox is that the French were absolute monsters. There was no way they were listening to the Muslim and Berber, the Arab and Berber population. They were as soon as there was a peep coming from them, there was a massacre, right? And nobody was found guilty, right? So it was just horrible. The French were the worst. Camus had false hopes that the French could reform, but they didn't, and naive views. But Fanon helped create the conditions for a dictatorship, for a change, what Arendt would call a change of guard. and a dictatorship that exists today. In fact, Fanon's wife, widow, committed suicide, and shortly after the Algerian Revolution happened. This was in the late 80s and 90s, where, well, it's not clear how many died, but it was hundreds of thousands of people killed. Because there was pressure on the FLN to relinquish power, there was an election, and the alternative to the FLN won, and the FLN wasn't happy about that, so the revolution started. And when Josie saw that, she said something along the lines, the wretched of the earth again, replicating the violence. In fact, interestingly, the FLN uses the same tactics as the French used, the electric shocks. They perfected that beautiful art of putting electricity on people's genitals and all over the place. Anyway, it was a horrible war. It ended horribly. Fanon's hopes were dashed. He would have been persona non grata in the new Algeria. I started this book with a concern that emerged regarding the silence of Fanon about the murder of his friend by the FLN. His friend is known as the architect of FLN. His name escapes me right now. It's Abane Ramdani. Abane Ramdani was killed in internecine murders. It turns out that the killings were happening in the tens of thousands, all the way through. And I find that really interesting, the dynamic within revolutionary movements and how the most ruthless elements within the movement tend to win out. And then they take power and they, so the military wing basically win. With the murder of Ramdani, there was another murder by the French. They were pretty good at that. Yes. They killed another person that was very close to Ramdani. And I think basically that ended the democratic wing of the FLN, and the military wing won out. So, but Fanon never says anything. He's silent. He's a loyal, even to the point of lying from time to time. Not only fantasies, but also lying half-truths. His work in El Mujahideen, the pamphlet of the FLN, attests to that significantly. So I'm going to read two sections. I'll just use a convention here because I use the people, but this means the category of people, an ideal, and the people like this means the actual people on the ground. Right? So I'm going to talk about a muddle that I think happens in Fanon. To genuinely care for someone is not only to care for who they are at present, but also for their becoming. Insofar as I care, I want to make a positive contribution to the lives of those I care about. This outline seems incontrovertible, but the devil is in the detail. For instance, there can be a fine line between contributing to the thriving of those cared for and condescension. It is easier to avoid the condescension if caring for others is informed by their wishes and desires. Without delving into issues that complicate matters, we should help those we care about on their terms. Things tend not to go well when the picture of the improved individual is in the carer's mind, is not shared, which is in the carer's mind, is not shared by the person towards whom care is directed. Things tend to worsen when the care is purely instrumental. That is, when I care for them only so far as they are part of a schema that is mine, such that the care is entirely a function of the role of those I care about in my projects. When the revolutionary vanguard talks about the people, the concrete people, as their object of care, it is typically done in relation to an ideal they endorse and not in terms of concrete others they allegedly serve. The category of the people is an abstraction, a dream of humanity that is not yet, and it presupposes in the vanguardist mind that what is there instead of the people, namely the people, leaves much to be desired. Vanguardism implies a contempt and simultaneously glorification. It implies contempt and not merely recognition of deficiency, for the vanguard takes it upon itself to guide those who cannot drive themselves in the vanguard's eyes. The ideal in question is what the vanguard believes, known by them, but not for the most part by those the vanguard believes to represent. Vanguardists are social architects who, like Le Corbusier, the architect, think they know how best to organize the people's affairs, on behalf of which they impose their world-building projects. This is one reason why the vanguard typically does not feel the need to consult actual human beings in their midst, and why, it should be added, they tend to have a penchant for authoritarianism. But of course, there is much confusion between actuality and utopian potential, between the people and the people. For the vanguard of the revolution typically speaks to the people in their public pronouncing, referring to them as the people, with the reverence and awe customarily reserved for spiritual beings. Indeed, those the vanguard addresses are, in true bipolar fashion, portrayed either as spiritual beings or as semi-human aberrations. This muddle cannot be settled in the mind of the vanguard, for on one hand, those they serve, like adults who never cease to be children, need saving, and on the other, they are the pure embodiment of an ideal type. And this muddle opens the door to manipulation and deceit, for although their voices travel to the people in their communications, they are speaking of the people with little or no regard for what the people think, provided that they toe the line, that they conform to expectations and follow the plan to the letter, or perhaps more charitably, that they obey the voice of reason and truth, of the glorious revolution as it manifests itself in the inspired imaginings of the vanguard. It is for their good, in any case, to listen and obey. Actual human beings become placeholders for the possible. With relative ease, they can become cannon fodder in the service of tomorrow that promises to outshine the depersonalizing, to borrow Fanon's word, present, to borrow Fanon's words, as I said, justifying carnage. Today is for the sake of tomorrow. The placeholder of humanity are good insofar as they perform the function of standing for future possibilities. Their bodies can be channeled by whatever means possible in the direction of this utopian vision, located in the vanguard's vivid imagination of the glorious ascent of the people. The condescending vanguard knows best and hence has little time for genuine engagement with those that are present, has little time for the actual concern of the people, except insofar as they ought ideally to mirror the concerns of the vanguard. The only place the people exist is in the heads of the revolutionary vanguard, but the vanguard cannot be lucid about their strange commitments. When standing on one pole of the bipolar continuum, they just think that their vision is incarnate. But the truth is that the vanguard's head is the home of the people, until they are given birth with the generous gift of the leavening, that's Fanon's word, blood of the people. Hence, in the mind of the vanguard, the problem relating to political representation cannot emerge, and concrete dissent is interpreted as counter-revolutionary, helping to justify the fate of those such as poor Sadia. Poor Sadia, her tale and many other tales are told by Murat Feraoun. She was basically arrested. She was a FLN fighter. She was arrested by the French, tortured badly, and one of the French soldiers took pity of her and let her go, provided that she never divulges that she was helped to escape. She arrives to the FLN headquarters and is promptly executed. The vanguard is in the mind. It's just in case she's become a spy, a turncoat, just in case. We just need to make sure that we don't have spies in our midst. And tens of thousands of people died like that. The vanguard, in fact, the FLN killed many more Muslim Algerians than French, than Europeans. Vanguardists are the representatives of the phantoms in their heads. There is nobody else, that is, no other human being to represent, Hence, the vanguard can operate as lawmakers, executioners, commanders-in-chief, and presidents. Imagine democracy in the vanguard's head and tyranny in the making. A tyranny that finds its justification in pure potential, in pure non-being established in the people. The vanguard drives the historical process that will lead to pure actuality. Yet more problems emerge if we consider that the very raison d'etre of vanguard is to help bring about a more equitable world. So they must struggle with their muddled commitments. One typical solution, if one can call it that, is to repeat, to confuse the people with the people, the ideal with the actual, something that readily happens among revolutionary elites. And it occurred to Fanon as well, even though in one of his moods he's explicitly anti-vanguardist, but in another he's not. He endorses and rejects vanguardism, which is also part and parcel of vanguardist logic. The vanguardist is compelled to recognize in times of lucidity that he is fighting for justice as he has seen the injustices committed against those concrete others for which he is fighting. The people are Fanon's new man, an abstraction that from Fanon's point of view is both embodied and not embodied in the concrete existence of the felaha, the fighters. Consider the following passage from The Wretched of the Earth. Quote, "No leader, whatever his worth, can replace the will of the people and the national government. Must first restore dignity to all citizens, furnish their minds, fill their eyes with human things, and develop a human landscape for the sake of its enlightenment and sovereign inhabitants." And here's another passage also from Fanon. "Architects and engineers, foreigners for the most part, will probably be needed, but the local party leaders must see to it that the techniques seep into the desert of the citizen's brain, so that the bridge in its entirety and in every detail can be integrated, redesigned, and reappropriated." Reminds me of Dr. Frankenstein. Indeed, there are many such passages strewn across The Wretched. The "we" in the first passage, dripping as it is with condescension, points in the direction of those responsible for the upliftment into the human realm of those who are waiting at the gates, namely the vanguard. And now consider the following passage, also from The Wretched. Quote, "As for the people living in their huts and their dreams, their hearts begin to beat to the new national rhythm, and they softly sing unending hymns to the glory of the fighters." Now, if you read Mulat Faraon, you'll know that this is just, it's just fantasy. Presumably, the glorious fighters, so that's the end of the quote, are both glorious and subhuman. They too are uplifted by the revolutionary process. But are they truly uplifted? Not if we take the following words seriously, also from The Wretched. Quote, "Today, the all-out national war of liberation, waged by the Algerian people for 7 years, has become a breeding ground for mental disorders." End of quote. So the glorious yet subhuman fighters are uplifted in the process of developing mental disorders. Interesting. The passage quoted above illustrates the bipolar logic of those in love with the people. This love is perhaps most emphatically and crudely expressed by Ernesto Che Guevara. Quote, "The blood of the people is our most sacred treasure, but it must be used to save the blood of more people in the future." Alienation and Freedom is already quoted earlier in the book. And quote, "And no one can deny that all this blood spilt in Algeria will definitely serve to leaven the great African nation." I'm making bread with blood here. Vampirism, pure and simple. Two related concerns are being expressed here. The people and the future, the people of the future and the great African nation. Both express utopian concerns for a tomorrow that is not yet. And at the same time, they express the instrumental relationship with those that the revolutionary vanguard, Fanon and Che among them, love, strange love. This is how bipolar logic works. I love the people because they will give birth to the people once they fulfill their sacred duty as instruments of the cause. But since the people are not yet the people, They must be sacrificed in the name of the revolutionary Elysium. The people are loved in this strange way, Dr. Strangelove kind of love, because their blood will flow and leaven or serve to raise the people of the future and the nation that is to come. The logic is elegantly summarized by Arthur Koestler, put in the mouth of Ivanov in his novel Darkness at Noon. Quote, he reads Machiavelli, Ignatius de Loyola, Marx and Hegel. He is cold and has no pity for humanity, but does this out of a kind of mathematical compassion. And he is forever damned to do what he loathes the most, become a butcher in order to stamp out butchery, sacrifice lambs so lambs will no longer be sacrificed, whip people so they will learn not to let themselves be whipped, eradicate all his moral impulses in the name of a higher moral, and court humanity's hatred because he loves humanity so abstractly and geometrically. The bipolar logic is expressed in the self-contradictory mathematical compassion and love for humanity that is abstract and geometrical. The love of the people is conditional, that is, dependent on the very specific utilitarian calculus. They are loved for what they will allegedly bring about, such that if they fail to bring it about, they would cease to be of any use in the eyes of the vanguard. For the larvae that remain after the leavening bloodbath would never metamorphosize into the splendorous ideal. So that's the end of the passage. And I just want to read one short passage, just to exemplify this issue. From Saadi Yassef. So Saadi Yassef is the producer of the Battle of Algiers. He was also the main commander during the Battle of Algiers, and he acts kind of as himself. The character that he represents is an embodiment of himself and other people. It wasn't 100% him, but it's based on his book. And he, in a 2008 interview, he died about a year ago, actually. Yes, and he was an interesting character, a bit conflicted, and I find that more interesting. But he said in the interview, quote, and this to me just embodies the instrumental logic that is so obscure. At the time, if I had had the money, I would have paid the French soldiers so that they would torture Algerians. So this is a Nigerian fighter who was saying, I would have paid to have Algerians tortured. Why? Because when an Algerian dies, great, as a result of torture, he has 10 or 20 relatives who will avenge his death and join the FLN. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you so much, Pedro. I think this is such a wonderful sort of meeting point of the two, Camus and Fanon in the book, right? This idea of what is actually good for the sustainability of entire communities rather than what is good for this particular moment right here, kind of forward-thinking politics. I think one of the most striking things about the book for me was your treatment of Fanon. I mean, you start off speaking about Fanon, and I'd always had this romanticized idea, you're eavesdropping on friends talking. This isn't going to be academic at all, but I'd always thought of Fanon's take on violence as not literal, although it is. You know, I'd always thought maybe he's speaking metaphorically. He's not speaking metaphorically. I always thought, you know, to get around this idea of the subsequent brutality of what would actually happen once that violence is enacted, right? So I guess my first question to you is, what is your what is your take? Maybe we can talk about, your take as you represent in the book on Fanon's investment on a personal level as part of the Revolutionary Party and kind of protecting those special interests, and in terms of his removal from the people, because he does critique intelligentsia. He says they're going to hijack the revolution. They could hijack the revolution, and that that basically it's peasants who are to inherit the earth. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about Fanon's special interests, specifically in relation to how you read his notion of violence.
Well, Fanon was a psychiatrist, and he was very influenced by a psychiatrist called François Tosquelles. François Tosquelles is a very interesting character. He's a Spanish dude, Basque, I think, and he escaped during the war in Spain, and he ended up running a psychiatric clinic in Algeria, and Fanon kind of does a practice there. And he's one of the founders of Tosquelles of institutional psychotherapy, and he thought that, and I think it's really interesting, it's kind of a synthesis, one could say, of, this is a simplistic reading of, but it's a synthesis of Freud and Marx. So the idea is that in order for a psychiatric institution to work properly, you need to work on the institution. So it's not the mad people that are mad, it's the institution that's mad. And if you fix the institution, the people will be fine. It's a pretty radical view. And I think that's exactly what he thought Algeria was. Algeria was a kind of madhouse. And you needed to fix the institution to fix the people. And I think that's part of his work. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting stuff there about Fanon. I mean, I'm not all critical of Fanon. I just told you that I've just finished a paper where I'm very positive about a particular aspect of Fanon's work, which doesn't deal with the issue of violence, although the violence cuts through his later work. It's not metaphorical. I think a lot of Fanon lovers tend to try to smoothen out Fanon, make him more palatable for the contemporary audience, saying that things like that he meant, and, which is true, I mean, that he meant, and I think there's something there as well, that the French would only respond to violence, and I think that's actually true. The problem is that he created this idealist picture, which wasn't going to come about, and didn't. And Camus predicted that better than Fanon. Even though Camus was beset by a colonial mindset, he just couldn't imagine an Algeria that wasn't. Algeria, by the way, wasn't a colony in the strict sense from the French point of view. It was three provinces of France. It was part of France, an integral part. Except there were these, Muslims that didn't quite know what to do, because if they gave them full citizenship, they would swamp France, and France would no longer be the wonderful place that it is, apparently. So that's a sort of picture so Fanon was onto something. I mean, when he recognized that the French would only respond to violence, but I think he spun a narrative that was a little bit too idealistic, given the conditions. And so did Camus, in a different way. From the other side, but I think Camus gives us an ethic, and this is the ethics of rebellion, from L'Homme Révolté, which is one of his second philosophical treatise, and last one, which was allegedly his favorite book, and that he had written, and I think it's a fantastic book. And his account of how we should conduct ourselves in the world, especially when it comes to fighting for justice, is extremely rich, and that's what I explained in the second half of the book. And I think it's richer than what Fanon has to offer, although Fanon has plenty of richness there as well in other dimensions of his work, which I don't explore in the book.
Yeah.
and I explore that as well.
So perhaps we should just jump right into an ethics of rebellion, right? The idea there seems to be, quite limited perspective as well with Camus. The idea that, because he had this idea that France had the capacity to solve the problem that it had created in Algeria, and that a post-independence democracy could potentially be led by France, which they didn't really buy into all of that in the end. But you talk about the ethics of rebellion as being about communication, right? Open communication, active citizenship. And I wonder if you want to share a bit of that.
Yeah, so the story is this is the Camus's cogito. So Camus's cogito, the cogito comes originally from Descartes, and it's I think therefore I am, right?
Mm.
And for Camus is I rebel, therefore we are. And how does that work? I think it's a really interesting move. He says, well, and this is something that cuts across his youthful work, The Myth of Sisyphus. He was 26 when that book was published. He was very precocious, and La Revolte, the rebel, as its translated in English. He says, well, think carefully about what happens when you rebel, right? Think about it. So if you rebel, and this is why his take on his negative on philosophical, what he calls philosophical suicide, which I think is his way of, as part of this 20th century attempt to overcome nihilism, right? In a secular world that's becoming more and more secular. How do we make sense of things? And so he gives us this account, and he thinks philosophical suicide is irrational. So how does this work? Well, if you are pissed off about something, and angry about the world and how terrible the world is, nature, other people, whatever, it's because you are already presupposing values that are embodied in you, that things matter to you, always and already. So look at what's presupposed in the very act of rebellion. But I can't just rebel on my behalf, right? So if I think that an injustice has been committed, I think an injustice has been committed. So there's a universalizing tendency there. It's not just, oh, you've been unjust towards me because I didn't get my toys, right? No, I can only claim legitimate, I am angry. The very act of being angry, pissed off about something, and going out and protesting presupposes a kind of universalization of my protest. So the we emerges in there. And that's how he talks about community, and he thinks that it's absolutely imperative that we look carefully at what happens when we rebel, and that we don't forget the values that set rebellion in motion. And if you do forget them, as revolutions tend to, then nothing good is going to come out of it. And that's the heart of the rebel, and that's where I think there's something really interesting going on in Camus. So he's giving us criteria. So leave the colonial mindset, his excessive optimism about the French, his inability to imagine an Algeria without France. Leave all those things aside and consider his ethic. And I think there's a lot of there that should inform, that I think should be informing our rebellion, our ability to rebel. And if we think about, there's so many parallels I think between Algeria and the current conflict in Israel and Palestine. But I'm not going to get into that unless someone else.
I will ask, but first I think it's your second view, particularly the ethics of rebellion. the assumption that there's a contract, right? That there's an ethical contract between me and the people that I inhabit the world with, and
It's
that
not a contract, really. He's not
An
a contractarian.
invisible-
Okay.
an invisible,
Okay, whatever.
metaphorical contract.
Yeah.
is that sufficient? But there's an assumption that certain lines cannot be crossed,
Yes,
and
of
we all
limits.
agree. We all agree that these specific lines cannot be crossed. So when those lines become crossed, I then, as an individual, can appeal to that collective understanding of where the limits are and say, look, something has been transgressed. And it seems to me that he's cautioning against tyranny, more so than Fanon. Because Fanon doesn't imagine that there would be tyranny, at least not as far as I know.
He hopes there won't be. He does give us some idea about how that might come about.
But he doesn't address it as clearly as Camus does, right? What do you think?
Yeah, and I think so. Fanon was obsessed with the mediocre bourgeoisie. So this is the kind of local Muslim population that was reaping the benefits of colonialism, and he thought that they were the real danger, and that if they got mixed up with government, nothing good would happen. And I think he's wrong about that. And it's not that there might be a mediocre bourgeoisie, whatever. I don't have a say there. Maybe it was, maybe it wasn't. I think it probably was and wasn't. It was complex. Lots of different people doing different things. But anyway. But the mistake, what he did not analyze, is the fact that the mediocrity was formed in the very revolutionary movement. The new middle class was formed within the revolutionary movement, within the FLN, the GPRA. He does talk very negatively about the GPRA in secret. He does talk about it to Simone de Beauvoir, he does talk about it to his friends. Simone de Beauvoir records that, but he never mentions it in his official writing. Never. He's quiet. So, sorry, and
warning against tyranny.
yeah, and right. So I don't think he gives us enough to. He doesn't give us enough to avoid that fundamental mistake. I think is something that blinded him to the real possibility of what was happening. And if he did know that it was happening, he certainly wasn't being open about it. Camus, on the other hand, gives us criteria for living as human beings among others. That I think is correct. He thinks we need to carry the weight of ethics with us always and never forget the values that were sacrificed. So he's not a pacifist. He's often construed, it's not true. He says explicitly that violence is, there is a warrant for violence. There's a reason why he joined the French resistance. He wasn't against killing, but he thought that killing always needed to be lamented. It was always, when he talks about the scrupulous assassins and things like that, the early revolutionary movement before the Soviets took over. He was very positive, but also not entirely positive about them, because they never forgot that they had committed a crime by killing someone, even though that killing someone might have been necessary. So if someone attacks me and I kill that person, because that was the only option I had, I should lament the fact. This is a feature. So, and this is the feeling bad about it, the sense that this is not, that this is something that shouldn't have happened, is something that Camus thinks we should always be present, and we should never forfeit any, and we should never, so to speak, set aside values, as revolutions tend to, some very key values, in order to bring about the utopia. Because by doing that, the utopia ain't going to come about. It's going to undermine, it's going to eat itself.
Yeah.
And that's what happened in Algeria.
Yeah,
that's what happened.
And Israel and Palestine?
Right, so I think a similar thing happened. So the FLN had its moment. When was the date that the Palestinians broke the gates and what was it?
7th of October.
7th of October.
Yeah.
So 7th of October happened. And so there was an equivalent in Algeria. It was the Philippeville massacre. It was kind of key there. So the French had been massacring. There were several massacres across since 1820 when the French invaded. Over and over massacres. The Muslim population would rise and they'd be crushed, often with Piedmont's help and stuff like that. And nobody was ever, none of the people who were involved in oppressing the protesters and villages and going on rampages were ever prosecuted. Anyway, so Philippeville happens. You know that if you commit a massacre of that sort, you know how the French are going to behave. You know the French are going to be the worst. They're just going to come on you. And what that's going to do is going to galvanize public opinion. And it's going to help, not only that, it's going to, the French are going to be exposed for their cruelty. And by showing that, you start getting shifts in international opinion, which is happening now. And I think that strategy of using your own people is, because that's what it is at the end. You're using your own people as cannon fodder. And you might say, well, there's no other option. Well, sorry, if that's the only option, it's not an option.
Yeah.
Right? It's not an option. You don't provoke the ogre so that the ogre then goes and kills your own people in mass, knowing that they're going to do that, right? If they didn't know, I think the height of naivety, they would have been the height of naivety. I think Philippeville was pretty deliberately calculated to provoke the French and make them express their monstrosity, right, very clearly and unambiguously. And I think that's what happened. So I think even if you look at Gaza, it's like there's a system of tunnels, and in between, the people are like the people from Gaza are like shields, right?
Yeah.
And they're the first point of violence of the Israeli state. The Israeli state cannot conceive. Interestingly, the same with France. And this is something that the Israeli state cannot conceive. And I know that when I was in Israel doing a postdoc, this was mentioned by someone from the left, actually, the guy who replaced Rabin, who was murdered. So I was there just after Rabin was murdered. I can't remember his name. And so he said that we cannot have shared sovereignty, because if we do that, this will become a Palestinian state. We will just be swamped by Palestinians, and that's not what we want. And I think something similar happened is that. So that's what's, I think, informing. And I think the same happened with France. France could not conceive. That's why they wasn't given citizen rights. Very few Muslims got citizen rights. Only the kind of a small fraction of the elites got citizen rights. But there was no way. They were happy to use labor. I mean, there was tons of labor in France, and you know, menial, very badly paid labor. But it was enough. It actually helped keep Muslim Algerians alive during the French colonial period. Again, the French didn't think that Algeria was a colony, but
It was.
it was. And they only just recently admitted that it was a war, that they weren't just oppressing these rabble-rousers. France is very slow to learn. So I think something similar is happening. I mean, I might be wrong. I'm not a political analyst, but there does seem to be pretty clear parallels there, and I wouldn't be surprised if this is a strategy.
Yeah.
It's a strategy of the disenfranchised, of the people who don't have power and don't have the arms to fight against a far greater foe, in a state that is sponsored by the U.S. in particular, but other people, Germany as well, and so that has huge amounts of technology. The Palestinians cannot possibly win a war militarily. They have to win a political battle. It's similar to South Africa. It wasn't quite like that because there wasn't a war, but it had to win a political battle. It had to win a political battle. It wasn't going to win. The people fighting against apartheid could not just. They didn't have the military might to be able to defeat the beast militarily.
And this is really one of the problems of advocating for violence, right? Because then you have people that have to be cannon fodder, right? That have to be in the front lines, and there doesn't seem to
Look
be...
at Sadi Youssef and what he said at the end, the
Yeah.
last thing I heard.
Yeah.
That cannot be a strategy.
A peasant-led revolt where the peasants themselves are going to inherit the earth, but are also going to be cannon fodder. It seems a bit.
Yeah.
It seems a bit ivory tower-ish of Fanon to me.
Vanguardist. Yeah.
Yeah, I thought so. Yeah.
And that's what he's normally considered to be an anti-vanguardist, but I think he's muddled.
Yeah.
And he's deeply condescending at times,
Mm.
as is Camus. I'm not glorifying one to the detriment of the other. I think Camus's ethics is rich and interesting, but he's not a... What intellectual is? I mean, I think there's something deeply disrespectful about treating intellectuals as martyrs. And one of the things I say at the beginning of the book, the Black Panthers, one of the Black Panthers referred to Fanon as a patron saint. And I think that's the height of I mean, you othering a thinker. You shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
We are humans muddling together, trying to make sense of things. None of us is a saint. Let's talk. And in fact, if Fanon had lived for longer, I'm sure he would have changed his mind quite significantly.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he died of leukemia before the end of the war.
Both of them died. They didn't
Yeah,
actually get to see. That's quite an interesting point in how Fanon would have known about Camus, but Camus would not have known about Fanon.
Fanon on very few occasions, here and there, is very critical of
Camus, yeah. And also, petty, last point, very petty politics, philosophers beefing, Sartre and de Beauvoir and Fanon and Camus, and how they're all beefing with each other for very... Because
probably the biggest intellectual scandal in the 20th century was the fight between Fanon and between Camus and Sartre over the rebel. Sartre was very unsubtle, and he was like he was not unqualifiedly supportive of the Soviet Union. It was Cold War. This was Cold War. It was a Cold War thing, and Camus was seen, even though he didn't like the United States, he was seen as an apologist of the United States, and Sartre saw the great, he had this fantasy from Café Les Fleurs about the wonderful Soviet Union. And the people were, I mean, Merleau-Ponty, these people were at times, for a period, bending backwards for a regime that I don't see how anyone could possibly justify. The gulags, the killings, and the Stalin, but even Trotsky and Lenin, and the crushing of the revolt of the Marines. He was already, that was the beginning, and Trotsky was the kind of guy who started the gulags. So these people, I don't know, there was a kind of blindness. That is pretty scary, and I think the blindness. I think Fanon was much more subtle than Sartre, and in fact, there's some evidence to suggest that in his deathbed, Fanon weirdly died in Maryland in a hospital. That eventually, he ended up in a place that he really hated in the U.S. The CIA helped. The CIA helped get him there. And he died in hospital shortly after. But apparently, Claude Lanzmann, who was a go-between, Claude Lanzmann is the director of Shoah, one of the great documentaries, fantastic 9-hour documentary. I use his work a lot, his biography a lot. He knew, and he apparently a copy of the for Fanon to read the preface. And apparently he wasn't super happy. And I can see why he wasn't super happy, because I think his preface was bloodthirsty in the extreme,
Yeah.
and much less subtle than
You referenced that
than-
in the book.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll open it up for some questions, concerns, ideas you might want to share. Thank you so much, Pedro. Yes.
You too. Thanks for writing a book about a very interesting topic. And I want to go back to the Israel-Palestine there. Because
I'm no expert.
No, I know, but the topic is very. I mean, this is not very. It's for you it's academic, and for us it's academic question, of course. But if you are in Palestine today, it's not an academic question.
No.
So I was just like. You're critical of Fanon, and I can accept the argument that when the liberation movement uses violence, it tends to brutalize the liberation movement and also the after liberation.
Yes.
But what do you do in a situation as a Palestinian today? There has been attempts in Palestine to do Camus. To follow the path of Camus. Yeah? So you had the peace process in the 90s, the Palestinians tried to negotiate with Israelis, they were giving nothing more or less.
Yes.
You had the
Rabin moment was a very important moment.
And you had in 2018, 2019 from Gaza even, they tried to get into Israel by peaceful means, protesting, they were shot by snipers. So isn't it the same case with Israel there? They only, like you said with the French, they really only understood violence. So what is isn't that a tragedy that in order to, and now as you rightly say also, now all of a sudden the Palestinian question is on everyone's mind, and maybe politically Israel is really losing. I mean now they take it to the Hague, etc., or they want them in the Hague. So like what do you do then in such a, how you know, so
Yep. And I'm going to say something that will not satisfy anyone, and not even me. Because I don't like to end up like this. But maybe the situation is tragic, as you said, and tragic in the Greek sense. There is, you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And Mulad Faraoun spoke about that, and he does it in a way, and he's in there. This is what I like about him, not me. He's in there. He's in the villages where one day the French come and kill, the next day the FLN comes and kills. And at the same time saying we need to be liberated from the French. But he doesn't have a solution. He doesn't offer a solution. And I'm not gonna, I'm very happy that there are no Gazans here, because it's very insensitive of me to say what I'm saying, is that maybe there is no solution, no real solution. What's happening now is an attempt at a solution, I think, but it's costing how many lives? And is that a solution? And so the way I think about it is, and it's not a good answer, is that France should have thought very carefully about its behavior, and it should have been able to understand what the consequences of its failure to listen to the Muslim population would end up very likely have done, and how nobody's going to win. And I think I could say the same with Israel. In fact, Hannah Arendt kind of says that, interestingly. She thinks that the whole setup from the beginning was screwed, and that was never going to end up well. And this is what we're happening. And there's no way it's going to end up well. It's going to take time. Thousands are going to die, and no one's going to win. And yeah, I don't like that, and I'm not going to put my mask on that claim. But it seems to be something where you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. I mean, there are other places where colonialism did transform, like where France, like Martinique itself. I'm sure it's not a perfect place, but Martinique voted to remain part of France, and but it's a different context. It's a different context. It's a different setup. It's a different set of conditions, and I'm not an expert, so I can't compare. Yeah, it's not a satisfactory answer. And in a way, the book is a book that leads to a kind of impasse and invites a kind of us to think with Camus in the end about how to conduct our lives vis-a-vis others. And that's the best I can do at the moment. I'm hoping I can do more. But what's happening there is truly tragic. And what happened in Algeria is truly tragic. It's just, I mean, when you have a power like the French doing what they were doing, I don't know how anything good will come out of that. And I think a similar thing with Israel. I don't know how it's possible to imagine a solution unless they bite the bullet and say, we're going to have Palestinian. Well, I don't even know if I agree with shared sovereignty. I think single shared sovereignty. I mean, separate. It's too late for shared. It's too late for shared sovereignty. I would have liked that. I like Buber's conception. His version of Zionism, which didn't really know, of shared sovereignty, and that Israel bites the bullet and says, we're not just going to be a Jewish state.
Thank you, Pedro.
But it's too late. How are you going to do that with all the resentment, all the death, all the... Sorry, I'm not. It's not a good. It's not a satisfying answer. It's not meant to be.
Yeah. I think Tim had.
I won't, but he wants to ask.
Probably early days to say, but what echoes of all this are we seeing in New Caledonia at the moment?
What's happening there? I don't know.
New Caledonia in the Pacific is still part of France and seems to be, I haven't really sussed it all out yet, but seems to be occupied by an actual majority of white French speakers and a minority of Indian Ocean Islanders, and they're proposing to change the laws to allow white French speakers to gain more votes. And the islanders are now rebelling very violently because they're afraid of being swamped in the electoral rolls and the numbers of it all. So, I mean, this has been going for, what, 2 or 3 days? I don't know.
It's been going for generations.
What you were saying about the dangers or the fears of being ethnically swamped in situations like Algeria and elsewhere is repeating itself, but again in the French context. So it's, I think Macron is flying out there today to try and sort something out. But.
We need to stop thinking in these ways. We need to just think. I mean, what these stories, these terrible historical events should teach us is that this is not the way to do things.
Yeah.
And I think what I find rich about Camus is that he's giving us some guidelines. Some guidelines. It's not exhaustive. It's a kind of an ethical orientation, which I think is very attractive.
Yeah.
And that's as far as I think I can go, really. I mean, but I have noticed that there seems to be situations where checkmates. There's historical checkmates, and once you reach that, what do you do?
And how do the ethics of care actually survive when the main antagonists seem just hell-bent on conflict, on antagonism, on wiping each other out in some fashion?
Yeah, that's right. Hatred and fear of the other, Islamophobia in the case of France, and in the case of Israel. Yeah. And mutual hatreds, deep. But the fact that the choice was made to I forgot the date again, 7th October? Right. 7 October happened. I mean, to think that that's not going to cause thousands of your people to die would have been naive. So it sounds very much like a strategy, and it's very similar to what happened. And it's a strategy of people who confuse the people with the people. That's another story that I think is important, is that we don't fall in love with abstractions, that we recognize that we have to work with what we have, and that we are the people that matter, the humans that are alive and flesh and blood, not the potential humans. And that's one of Camus' central lessons that come from the rebel. Long revolt.
I think we'll take 2 more questions.
Pedro, can you talk a bit about the cleansing of violence?
The cleansing force of violence that Fanon.
Yeah. I'm thinking, I mean, sometimes you cannot help. That is what you have to do to get rid or to clean yourself.
I don't.
Can I think of the one who killed Urgente Blanche, who actually called the police afterwards to say, we did it. That there's a moment of release in it.
Yeah, if we're thinking about Arendt is interesting here. Arendt on revolution. So she thinks that violence tends to take on a life of its own, and especially if it's long-term and systematic without a clear end and without a very clear goal, very specific goal, like self-defense, immediate, like you attack me and you attack back. If you do that, then you're not going to get. You're certainly not going to get any therapeutic benefits. I mean, I think Fanon admits that. So there's a tension there. In chapter 1, I think it's chapter 5 and 1, on violence, he says cleansing force. Chapter 5, mental disorders, right? And so he was dying. He was writing as a dying man, so he was in a rush to finish. So I think that's why, that's my sense. But also, to me, it's a sense of a complex man who has complex ideas, and he hasn't really they haven't fully come together, right? But he recognizes that these are 2 options. Yeah, but I don't want to say, I don't know how to, let me say what Camus would say is we had to kill. Right during the French occupation of France, we had to kill. We had to engage in acts of terrorism, kill, and I think this is where I think the therapy that needs to happen is a therapy where I recognize that I violated a moral principle. Maybe I had to do it. Maybe it was necessary. Maybe I had to set an example. If you read Zora Drift's account, which I don't like at all, she was the one who put the bomb in the milk bar. I don't know if you know the milk bar. Zora Drift is dripping with condescension, is dripping with hubris, I should say. She says, I don't feel anything for these French. I don't feel anything for the people who died. This was something that had to happen. People are asking me to say that and what I find interesting about Yasser, on the other hand, is that when he was interviewed, he expressed doubt. When he went and saw that in the bombing, he was dressed as a woman, he went to go and have a look, he used to do that. He would, in disguise, he would go and he saw that one of his friends, soccer friends, Pierre was dead in the casino bombing, had died, and his wife was alive without legs. And he was torn by that. And I think if we're going to engage in acts of violence, we need to have that sense of, if we need to do that, if we need to engage in acts of violence, we need to have that sense that something has been sacrificed. And so I don't know how we can reconcile that with the idea of, this release of anger. I normally don't. When I get pissed off and I get angry, my normal reaction. But this is right. This is out of context. It's like petty stuff. I normally feel like an asshole after that I've lost control that I wish I wasn't. I could remain a loving person. But at the same time, I recognize that that's not always acceptable and good. So, Anki, I'm not giving you a good answer. I'm giving you my confusion.
We have room for just one last question. If you'd
Thank you.
like to.
Thanks very much. I was for a while wondering, you've worked quite a lot on the Algerian question and why you'd be interested in it. You're living in South Africa. There's quite strong parallels. But what happened was very different. So we had a negotiated transition, a revolution. So do you think we're better off for it?
Probably, but I'm not fully happy with the negotiations.
We have a very violent society.
I think we could have done a lot better.
But we have an election in a week's time. That's one game.
Yes, that is
And
one
there's a
game.
multitude of parties. That did not happen in post-independence Algeria.
No.
There one party took over, and it was a very strict regime.
Murderers, torture was practiced using the French Gigène, what's it called? I think it's this generator that they use for communication. They kind of tweaked with it.
I'm just thinking, because there's so much violence in this country, ongoing.
No.
It's just
Yeah.
And we talk about it now at this moment. Nobody's going to tell us it's wrong, and I think that's healthy. If you say there's a tragedy in Israel, I don't agree with you, because tragedies presuppose that after the fall you have an insight into a universe in which ethical action is so important, and nobody there thinks they're wrong or right. They all think they're right. And that's to me very sad, and here at least we are trying to love each other, I hope.
Yeah, I'm talking about non-redemptive tragedies. But yeah, I think we could have done a lot better. But I don't think the revolutionary road, which some people wanted, Chris Hani apparently, and the multilingualist, what's his name? Yes, no other they thought that we needed to engage in a proper revolution to get this country to its place. And I wouldn't be surprised if Fanon was in the background. I do find it interesting because people often compare Biko with Fanon. And what I find interesting about Biko is that he didn't have this story about violence. He had a different story. He had a story about education and growth and building institutions in a regime that was radically unjust. That to me is more redemptive. It's more redemptive than, and if something like that could have happened in Algeria, again, you might accuse me of being conservative, gradualist, but maybe some gradualist institution building, and Arendt also thinks that institutions should play a central role in the growth. And that could be a way of people organizing themselves. But I don't have enough details of the history of Algeria to know if that was even possible. I know that the French tried to, in their lame attempts, which is mainly just to pacify people more than actually to change the status quo, they tried to do something like that at some point, but it didn't. It was all BS, basically.
And on that note,
BS.
and on that note, I think we'll give Pedro a round. I think I'm gonna close off with a few thanks. I don't know if you have specific people that you would like to thank, but I would like to thank a few people. The first one being the Alan Gray Center for Leadership Ethics, who funded most of this, and specifically Sharon Dacre, who helped us administratively and in other ways. Just this would not have been possible without her. I would also like to thank the institution that is Sally Matthews, for all of your advice and thoughtfulness. None of this would have happened even with our two heads put together if you weren't around. So thank you, Sally. And mostly I'd like to thank you, Pedro, for writing this book. It's an incredible, groundbreaking combination of very various perspectives, and I want to have a look through it again because I'm trying to see if maybe there can be some, some overlap. Maybe we can take a bit from here and a bit from there. I don't know. I haven't made up my mind. But thank you for writing the book.
If you can help me change my mind, you have helped me grow, which is even better, which is great. My mind is never fully made. I don't like fully made minds.
Yeah. I'd also like to thank the Rhodes University Research Office, specifically the director, Jane Roberts, who's been very supportive in putting together the event. And I would also like to thank Professor Mwepu for coming through today and representing Rhodes University support for us. And and I think thank you to every single one of you for coming. This has been really, really fantastic. And please have some wine.
Should I do mine? Very simple. Thank you for being here,
Yeah.
Thando. What you've done is a beautiful gesture.
What you've done.
And you're teaching me how to be a human being.
Oh,
And that's really nice.
That's
I mean,
nice.
you just came out and you just said, because I don't, as I said, I'm not good at self-advertisement, but it's the pillar I'm weakest at. I don't want to develop it, but you it's a gift. Thank you. I take it as a great gift.